In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up your objects so that you can practice shallow depth of field using 3 objects. So, the first thing that you really need is you need 3 objects. For me, I had a bunch of cameras sitting around, so I chose 3 different cameras. When you choose your objects, it doesn't really matter what you choose, but I would make sure that they are not too small, and I would make sure that they have some sort of details on them. This one, you can see the labels, as well as there's got these like small details of gears and the lens and stuff like that. If it's a very simple object, kind of like a round red ball or something, then we're not going to be able to tell whether those details are in or out of focus. For the most part, you're going to need a lot of blur before the ball itself gets blurry around the edges. And even still then, it might be kind of tricky. So it's easier if you have something that has some sort of fine detail that'll make it easier to tell if it's in or out of focus. Next thing is setup. With your objects, what you want to do is you want to set up your objects so they're about a foot away from each other. If you have them too close, like if I have them right here, what's going to happen is that when you're taking your picture and you're shooting, our focal range is going to come out and it's probably going to hit all of them at the same time. So all of these objects are going to be in focus. But if we space them out, my focal range will come out and one thing will probably be in focus, and by the time that I get to another thing in focus, the other thing will be outside of that focus. So that'll be helpful. It's also good to pay attention to your composition, to the things in your scene, and how you're setting things up to make it interesting. I have used this lovely leading line of this like wood board, and I would probably try to find something better, but this is what I have in my classroom at the moment and where I can set things up. But I'm going to play with the chords and stuff. Maybe I'm going to set up a couple so that they're slightly in like different ways. I'm creating like S-curves and things with the chords. And I think I'm going to extend, there we go. I extended the lens on that so that I have some interesting details. Now when it comes to shooting, you want to consider those 3 things of proximity, of focal length, and of aperture. Proximity, again, when you're shooting, you want to get really close to your object. You want to be able to, when you are taking a picture, be able to touch your first object. Or if you're shooting a person, make sure that you can reach out and touch them on the shoulder or something that's appropriate. If you're too far away, what's going to happen is that you're going to be shooting in deep depth of field, and that's not going to look as good. So make sure that you get really close to your object, because the distance that you create between this object and that object, or the perceived distance, is going to help us to create more interesting shallow depth of field. So our second thing is considering the focal length. The focal length is the lens of the camera. So having a longer lens is going to create more dynamic shallow depth of field, while having a shallow lens or a wide-angled lens is going to make it look more like deep depth of field, because it's trying to look at the entire scene and gather everything in the scene. A 18mm is a wide-angle lens. A wide-angled lens is good for deep depth of field, whereas a 55mm lens is the beginning of a telephoto lens. So if you're working on cameras that are simulating it, such as like camera phones, what you're going to look for is the millimeter length and try to get it to a higher millimeter length, or whether it says wide angle or telephoto. So I'm going to set this to a telephoto lens so that the distance between one object to the other seems a lot further because it's zoomed in so far. So those are my 2 things. Something that you might try is, if I get really close to my first object, move my second object back further, it's going to feel like these are further separated apart, and this will become more out of focus. But I don't need to do that so much yet. I'll experiment with those later. Lastly, we are going to set our camera to aperture mode. So change your camera to A or AV, which stands for aperture mode. And then you're going to use the dial, or you're going to use the selection on the display to change the aperture opening to really wide. A wide aperture has an f-stop that is a small number, because remember, it's a fraction. So an f1.2 lets in a lot of light and creates a lot of shallow depth of field, whereas an f11 lets in a little amount of light and has a very narrow hole, so it creates deep depth of field. So I'm going to change this to the smallest, or to the widest that I could get my aperture. And now I'm all set. You can also use portrait mode, which on a camera sets it so it has a wide aperture, but on a phone camera what it does is it does some auto editing so that it looks like the background is blurry and other objects are in focus. When you're shooting, again, we're going to shoot close to it, and we want to make sure that we're shooting from our first object into our second object and then through our scene to our last object. That's part of why I wanted to use this cool wood board, so that I can create a leading line through everything. But the reason why we do that is because we are following this range of focus. My range of focus is going to move through these different objects. So if I shoot on this side over here, and I shoot from my camera, remember my analogy of the wave, that wave or range of focus is going to come out this way and hit all my objects at the exact same time. So everything's going to be either in focus or out of focus. Not what we want. Also, don't shoot directly above it. It's going to do that same thing. That range of focus is going to come down and hit it all pretty much at the same time. So when you're shooting, you want to be shooting through our images. And if you want to give a little bit of a tilt, or a little bit higher to get a different angle, or lower to get a different angle, you can. Just make sure that, that it's going to hit one object and the next and the next. So I'm arranging this so my first object is in like rule of thirds, and then my last object is in rule of thirds in the opposite. And then you're going to change the focal ring. And I'll show you what that looks like through the camera. So here we go. We have my three objects. I'm moving from this one in the foreground. I'm going to change it to manual focus. I'm going to focus on the first object. So my first object is nice and sharp. And it's hard to see on this one whether it's fully sharp, so I might have to take a couple and then zoom it in or put it on my computer. But I'm going to take my picture so my first object is in focus. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to still use the same scene, but I'm going to adjust my focus ring so that my second object is in focus. And it's okay if you move just a little bit. If you're using a camera that has autofocus, such as a point and shoot, you might have to move a little bit so that your camera knows what thing you're focusing on. But try to keep a roughly the same area. If you're using a phone camera that has an LCD screen where you can change the focus, point or touch the screen so that it focuses on the second thing. But I'm going to focus my ring so that it focuses on that one. I'm going to take my second picture. The last thing that you're going to do is you're going to take one more picture, but this time we're going to think of deep depth of field. Again, we'll go back to our 3 steps for affecting depth of field. 1, I'm going to change the aperture. So I have a narrow aperture. So I'm going to go to an f22. Then I'm going to change my focal length. So I am going to move this to a wide angle so that it is so it's showing more of the scene. And then lastly, I'm going to change my proximity, and I'm going to move back just a little bit. And moving back might be all that you can possibly do if you're working off of a phone camera. But do what you can, and then get as much of the scene in focus, and then take your picture. So that's all you guys need to really do for your 3 objects practice. Try out different storytelling, different setups. You still want to keep this three objects in a line, but you can move things a little bit. Maybe I could, whoops, good thing that's an old broken camera. I could move this line up here, and I can kind of put them at different angles or have the lines leading to each other so they feel like they're interacting. Or I could get different objects. Play around with your storytelling, but mostly what you're going to be graded on is whether you have three photos. One where the first object is in focus, one where the second object is in focus, and then a third one where all three objects are in focus.